So Andrew asked me to come and to say a few words about your scripture reading today, the burning bush, and particularly to look at some insight from the Jewish tradition about, and from the world tradition about Moses, about the burning bush, about what he's about to do. When we look at this towering figure of Moses, we see that this story, this character, has had a profound influence on Western civilization for literally thousands of years. 100 years ago, there was a Jewish philosopher, Echad Ha'am, who wrote entirely in Hebrew, which was something, Hebrew had been a dead language, so he was writing in a language that really people didn't speak. And he wrote a very famous essay about Moses. He begins by talking about the fact that even in his time, 100 years ago, there was huge academic debate about whether Moses really existed or not. So you have, half the world saying, of course, it says in the Bible, it's an absolute true historical event. And then you have half the world saying, no, it's a mythology, it's a made-up story, it never really existed. But he came to a startling conclusion, Echad Ha'am. He says the following: the hero who lives on through the ages is not the hero as he was in his lifetime, but a creature of the popular imagination which produces what the people wants and likes. And it is this imaginary creation, not the short-lived actuality, that influences mankind for hundreds of thousands of years. In other words, he was saying that in many ways it doesn't matter if Moses lived or not. That even if he did live, the stories we tell him perhaps are different maybe than what was in his real life. But the point is, according to Echad Ha'am, that this figure of Moses has affected us today. He says today, 100 years ago, but I would say today, now, in the 21st century, that the figure of Moses has influenced us so profoundly, and of course in Western culture in general, not just in the Jewish tradition, but in your Christian tradition as well. Even in the Muslim tradition, this figure of Moses has had a really, really profound influence. And his story is an incredibly profound one. So we can see a lot of the power of this story and of the whole Exodus, even in the brief scene which you read earlier, the scene of the burning bush. It is an incredible, vivid scene. It is terrifying. We're told that Moses was terrified and had to hide his eyes. That there are questions that we could ask. For thousands of years, we look at this story and we ask questions about it. What speaks from the burning bush? If you actually read the account, which you did earlier, it seems to be contradictory. Is it an angel that speaks from the burning bush? Or is it God? Is it God that speaks from the burning bush? It seems to say both. And as a matter of fact, when we look at it today, we're so influenced by medieval and Renaissance Christian art. In other words, it says, well, let me just look at it here. When it talks about an angel, it says, an angel of the Lord appeared to him in a blazing fire out of a bush. Now, the way we always seem to understand that, at least in the Christian tradition, at least in the Christian art tradition, is that this isn't a beautiful angel with wings and, that you can see this angel in the midst of the bush. But the text actually seems to imply that the bush itself is the angel, that the burning bush itself is the angel. In other words, because of Renaissance and medieval art, we seem to be particularly hung up that angels need to look like people. The Hebrew tradition doesn't seem to imply that. The word in Hebrew for angel is malach, which literally means a messenger, which is the exact same thing that angel means. The word angel comes from the Greek angelos, which really means a messenger. And in the Bible, the Hebrew scriptures in any case, a messenger can take any form. You need only to read the book of Ezekiel and see these incredible creatures, which are in fact angels of God, messengers of God. Nevertheless, it seems to be contradictory. Who speaks to Moses? Is it this angel? Is it God? It says later on, when the Lord saw that he had turned aside to look, God called to him out of the bush. So what is that all about? That's one question. Another question, in this very chapter that you just read, God tells Moses that he and Aaron and the elders of Israel will go to Pharaoh to tell Pharaoh, let my people go. It says right there. But then later on, when we actually, in chapter 5, at the very beginning of chapter 5 of Exodus, when Moses finally does go to Pharaoh, it's only Moses and Aaron. It's not the elders. So what is that all about? Another question. Why does God, in fact, need a person to be his agent? Can't God do anything? Why doesn't God just zap the Pharaoh or just, transport the people out of Egypt? Why does he need a person like Moses to go in and do this? Another question. Why does God tell Moses to take his shoes off? What is that all about? Of course, we just heard one possible explanation, but there could be a million explanations of that. Another question. Did this burning bush really exist, or was it an illusion? Did Moses think he saw a burning bush? Did it really exist? Or maybe it was a story later. So there are all of these stories, and really and truly, the traditional Jewish way of looking at any biblical story, and this is what the rabbis did 2,000 years ago, they really concentrated on these questions, because they said the truth of these stories is not so much what you read on the surface, but what is written in between the lines. In fact, I probably mentioned this last time I was here, but one of my favorite rabbinic sayings from 2,000 years ago is that the Torah, the 5 books of Moses, which was given to Moses on Mount Sinai, is black fire written on white fire. That's just a wonderful image. The black ink on the white pages is black fire written on white fire. But the rabbis went farther. They said, somehow today we only seem to be able to interpret the black fire. But the most profound truths are, in fact, the white fire. It's somehow written in the spaces between the letters, but we haven't evolved enough to really understand the true meaning of this. So there are many questions, but I find one of the most intriguing questions of all is, why Moses? Why was Moses the one to finally go and as God's agent? And so that there are a lot of answers to this question. One answer is, Moses was in a perfect position to do this. He grew up in the palace of the Pharaoh, so he knew how to talk to the Pharaoh. So that's possibly one reason. Another reason, that even when he was young, he stood up for the helpless and for the unprotected. If you remember the story where he kills the taskmaster, who he sees beating a Hebrew. It's not even clear that he knew that he himself was a Hebrew, and yet he had this sense of justice. And he killed the Egyptian because he was so outraged by the injustice of it all. Of course, the story is a little problematic, isn't it? I mean, he was a prince. He could have just said, stop it. He could have said a lot of things. Why did he kill the taskmaster? So, and of course, in the Bible itself, when the children of Israel go into the land of Egypt, that God tells Moses he is not entitled to go into the land of Egypt. And he says specifically, it's because of Moses' anger and his impetuous nature. It's not so much for the taskmaster, it's because he's told to speak to the rock early and it will give water, and instead of speaking to the rock, he hits the rock. So God, at the end, tells Moses he can't go into the promised land because of that. And there are other reasons. He was a shepherd. He knows how to take care of things, and there's many stories about that. Nevertheless, there are reasons why you would think that, well, maybe Moses isn't the right person, his impetuous and angry nature. He flees justice from Egypt after he kills the Egyptian. We don't know that he really knows that he's an Israelite. He lives in the desert away from civilization. He marries the daughter of a pagan priest. Joseph Campbell, who's a scholar of myth and mythology, writes that all heroes of all great stories are always the same hero. In fact, his great book about heroes is called The Hero with a Thousand Faces. He says that they're all the same. They all go through 3 stages: separation, initiation, and return. They separate from the people that they are going to save. They're somehow initiated into their mission, and then they return to actually do their mission. And if you think about it, so many stories of great heroes follow that pattern. Moses certainly does. Oedipus, Odysseus, even Luke Skywalker, in Star Wars follows that same pattern. And you know something? Even in history, people follow that pattern. Think for a minute of Martin Luther King, who grows up in the segregated South. He studies theology at Boston University, where he wrote his doctoral dissertation on the theology of nonviolence, and then he returns to the South to lead his people. Separation, initiation, and return. And so Moses is the same thing. One of the most intriguing parts of Moses is that Moses, when God speaks to him, here's this incredible miracle, this burning bush that's not consumed, and God speaks to him out of the flame and wants him to go and save the Israelites. What does Moses say? He says no. And not only does he say no, but he says no 5 times in chapters 3 and 4. The first time he says, who am I to go to Pharaoh and free the Israelites? And God says, well, I'm going to be with you. Then he says, well, when they ask me what this God's name is, what am I going to say? And God says, tell them it's Eyeh Asher Eyeh, which your King James English says, I am what I am, or I am who I am, but the Hebrew actually means I will be what I will be, a really intriguing notion that God is evolving. I will be what I will be. Then he says, what if they don't believe me? And God says, okay, I'm going to give you these signs. See the staff, throw it down, it turns into a snake, put your hand in your bosom, it's come out, it'll be leprous, and then you put it in and it's gone. So you're going to have these miracles and everyone will believe you. And then he says, well, I'm not a man of words. Tradition says that Moses stuttered. It says in Hebrew he was a kavad peh, heavy of mouth. We don't know really what that means, but we assume that means he stuttered. He says, I can't. I'm not going to be, I can't. And God says, it's okay, Aaron is going to speak for you. You'll tell Aaron what to say, and he'll speak for you. And then finally, he says, send someone else. And that's when God gets angry. He says, no, you! And so this is really an incredible message. Number one, the heroes of the Old Testament are human beings. They have fears, they have weaknesses. They're like us. Maybe they're a little better than us because they overcome their weaknesses. But it reminds me of that famous quotation from Shakespeare's Twelfth Night, where Malvolio, who's convinced that his mistress, Olivia, he's a servant, and as a joke they try to convince him that she's actually in love with him. And so he's going to court her, and he says, some are born great, some achieve greatness, and some have greatness thrust upon them. And that's really almost every single Old Testament hero. They're not born great. They're not necessarily great people. They're flawed people just like we are. But they have greatness thrust upon them, and such is the case of Moses. He doesn't want to be a prophet. In fact, no prophet wants to be a prophet. Who wants to be a prophet? The essence of prophecy isn't that you can tell the future. The essence of prophecy is that you need to speak out against evil. And that's a really, really hard thing. All of them. Moses is the first prophet. He doesn't want to be a prophet. Isaiah, when he's told that he has to represent God, says, woe is me, all is lost. Ezekiel has to have these incredibly terrifying visions in order to convince him to be a prophet. Jonah tries to flee from God's word because he doesn't want to be a prophet. I think one of the most profound statements of the effect of this not wanting to be a prophet, in one of my favorite passages in all of the Bible is Jeremiah. Jeremiah, God sends him as his prophet, as his messenger, and Jeremiah says the following in chapter 20 of Jeremiah. I'll read you the first couple of lines in Hebrew because it's poetry and it's really very powerful. Pititani Adonai ve'epat, chazaktani vatukal. You enticed me, O Lord, and I was enticed. You overpowered me, and you prevailed. I have become a constant laughingstock. Everyone jeers at me. Every time I speak out, I must cry out, I must shout, lawlessness and violence. For the Lord of the Lord causes me constant disgrace and contempt. I thought, I will not mention him. No more will I speak in his name. But his word was like a raging fire in my heart, shut up in my bones. I could not hold it in. I was helpless. That is such an amazing statement. And you know that Moses, yes, Moses is a human, but we humans can also be more like Moses or like a prophet. That the Torah tells us, follow not the crowd to do evil. And perhaps if more of us were like Jeremiah or like Moses, no matter how painful it is to do the right thing, no matter how painful it is to speak out against injustice, to speak out against violence, against evil, that we need to do that. That I think the story of Moses continues to be a profound story for us throughout all the generations, because it tells us that there are times when we need to put aside our self-interest and we need to think about doing the right thing. So thank you.